I've been in NASCAR for over 40 years. I've driven the cars, I've felt the walls, I've buried friends. And I'm telling you right now, there were 5 men in that sport that weren't like the rest of us. Kenny Wallace, son of a racing legend, brother of a champion, 30-plus years behind the wheel in NASCAR's most competitive eras. He didn't just watch history happen, he raced against it. Today, at 63 years old, he's putting 5 names on the stand, and he's prepared to defend every single one. People ask me all the time, Kenny, who's the greatest NASCAR driver you ever saw? And everybody wants a quick answer. They want a name they can argue about on the internet, but I've been there. I've sat 3 inches from greatness at 190 miles an hour. I've looked in my mirror and seen something that didn't make sense. A car doing things that cars aren't supposed to do. Driven by a man doing things men aren't supposed to do. So no, I'm not giving you a quick answer. I'm going to take you to the witness stand with me, and I'm going to tell you exactly what I saw. Not what the record books say. Not what the media told you. What I personally, with my own eyes and my own fear, witnessed. 5 drivers, 5 cases. 0 debate. Let's go. Case number 5. And before I say this name, I need you to understand something. 5th place on this list is still a conversation most drivers never get to have about themselves. 5th place here means you made Kenny Wallace feel like an amateur. Rusty Wallace. Yeah, my brother. Now look, I know what you're thinking. Kenny, of course you're putting your brother on the list. No, stop. I grew up in that man's shadow. I know what bias looks like. And I also know what talent looks like. And what Rusty had was something I couldn't explain even when I was living next to it. Rusty Wallace was the most natural car driver I have ever seen in my life. Not the most decorated, not the most celebrated, the most natural. The man could feel a race car the way a surgeon feels a scalpel. He didn't drive the car, he wore it. Now Rusty won a championship in 1989. 54 Cup wins. But the numbers aren't even the point. What separated Rusty from everybody else wasn't what showed up on the stat sheet. It was what you saw on short tracks. Bristol, Martinsville, Richmond, where there is nowhere to hide and car control is everything. That's where Rusty Wallace became something that didn't make sense to watch. One thing never changes in how Kenny describes his brother across every interview, every podcast, every conversation that goes deep enough to get to the truth. The word he always comes back to is feel. Rusty could feel what a car was doing before the data showed it, before the engineers saw it. Before anyone else in the field had even processed that something was wrong, Rusty had already corrected it and gone faster. That is not a teachable skill. You are born with it, or you are not. Growing up watching that every day, you think it's normal. It was only when Kenny got into race cars himself and realized that nobody else on earth drove like that he finally understood what he had been watching his whole life. But here's the thing about number 5 on this list. Rusty was brilliant, but the 4 men above him, they were something else entirely. Case number 4. And this one is going to make some of you stop the video and go to the comments. Good. Go ahead. I'll wait. Jeff Gordon. Kenny raced against Jeff Gordon in his prime. He was there, in the garage, on the track, in the meetings. He saw that man operate up close, across years, under every kind of pressure the sport can produce. And here's the thing about Jeff Gordon that nobody ever talks about. It wasn't his speed that made him terrifying. It was his composure. You could race Jeff Gordon hard, door to door, bumper to bumper, and he would never flinch, never lose his head, never make an emotional mistake. The rest of us are human beings out there. We get angry, we make bad decisions, we push back when we shouldn't. Jeff Gordon raced like he was playing chess while the rest of us were playing checkers. At 190 miles an hour. 4 championships, 93 wins. And the way those wins came, They weren't all dominant wire-to-wire performances. Some of the most remarkable things Jeff Gordon did happened in the final 30 laps of a race, when the pressure was at its absolute maximum. That's when most drivers tighten up. That's when mistakes get made. Jeff Gordon got looser. He got cleaner. He got faster. What Kenny has consistently pointed to when he talks about Gordon isn't the raw talent, because NASCAR has always had talented drivers. It's the mental architecture. The way Gordon constructed a race in his mind and then executed it with almost zero deviation from the plan. That level of cognitive control at racing speeds is something that separated him from virtually every peer he ever had. He didn't just race better than you. He thought better than you. He was always 3 moves ahead. 4 championships, 93 wins, and that number should have been higher, but as composed as Jeff Gordon was, the man who comes next didn't need composure. Because he didn't need to think. What he did was instinct, pure, violent instinct, case number 3. Imagine what it felt like to line up on the grid and look to your left and see Dale Earnhardt staring back at you. Not Dale Earnhardt Jr., Dale Earnhardt, the intimidator, the man in the black car, number 3. People today talk about Dale Earnhardt like he's a legend, a myth, something from a story. He was, but he was also real. And racing against him was one of the most frightening experiences any driver of that era ever described about their professional career. Not because he was dirty, not because he was reckless, because Dale Earnhardt raced like the track belonged to him. And he made you believe it. The consistent thread through every story Kenny tells about racing against Earnhardt is psychological. Earnhardt didn't just beat you with a faster car. He beat you before you ever turned a wheel. He beat you in the way he carried himself in the garage. He beat you in the way he positioned his car in your mirror. He communicated a certainty, an absolute conviction that the outcome had already been decided, and most drivers on some level accepted it before the green flag ever dropped. That is an extraordinarily rare competitive weapon. 7 championships, 76 wins, and the respect, not the manufactured PR kind, but the real, private, reluctant respect of every man who ever shared a track with him. What was underneath the intimidation was a man with an ability to control a race car that defied physics and logic. Earnhardt could do things in the draft at Talladega and Daytona that people who study the sport for a living still struggle to fully explain. He could feel air. He could feel momentum shifting 3 car lengths ahead of where his bumper was. He raced super speedways like he had information that nobody else in the field had access to. When Dale Earnhardt walked into a room, the room changed. When Dale Earnhardt was in your mirror, you changed. And we lost him too soon. Way too soon. 3 drivers down, 2 to go. And what comes next is where this list gets genuinely uncomfortable. Where the honest answer is going to require setting aside what you feel and looking at what the evidence actually demands. Case number 2. Jimmie Johnson. There is a generation of NASCAR fans who never fully appreciated Jimmie Johnson. Some people thought he was boring. Some people thought the Chad Knaus and Hendrick Motorsports machine was bigger than the man. Those people are wrong. And that comes from someone who was inside the sport during Johnson's dynasty. Someone who watched what that man did to fields of cars that had every resource, every advantage, every piece of data and technology available to them. 7 championships. 7. Tied for the most in the history of this sport. And he built that record in the modern era. The era of full-time television coverage where every team is studying every other team, where the margins are razor thin and information is everywhere and secrets last about 48 hours. To dominate under those conditions for that long is not a product of equipment. Equipment explains a good run. Equipment does not explain 7 titles across nearly a decade against the best-funded, best-prepared competition the sport has ever fielded. What made Jimmie Johnson different was what he did in the final stage of a race when the championship was on the line. The bigger the moment, the better he performed. That is the single rarest quality in professional motorsport. Most athletes tighten under maximum pressure. A small number maintain their level. An almost non-existent group actually elevates. Jimmie Johnson elevated. The chase format, designed arguably to create chaos and give challengers a legitimate shot at knocking off the leader, became almost irrelevant when Johnson was in contention, because Jimmie Johnson in a must-win situation was more dangerous than Jimmie Johnson with a comfortable points lead. The fact that he's underappreciated doesn't change his resume. The resume doesn't care about your feelings. 7 championships, 1 spot left. And when you hear who's number 1, some of you are going to nod. Some of you are going to be shocked. Some of you are going to argue. But all of you are going to listen. Because this answer doesn't come from a stat sheet. It comes from 40 years of being in that garage, on those tracks, inside that world, from what was witnessed firsthand across an entire career. But before the name gets said, there's something you need to understand first. Kenny Wallace grew up in a racing family. His father, Wendell Wallace, wasn't a fan sitting in the grandstands. He was a racer, a professional, a man who understood this sport from the inside and had competed at its highest levels. Wendell Wallace was not a man who was easily impressed. He did not hand out compliments. He did not talk about other drivers with reverence. Except once. Except one name. And Kenny watched that as a child. He watched his father, a hard, competitive, unsentimental man, talk about one driver differently than he talked about any other human being he had ever competed against. Something shifted in him when that name came up. The assessment came from somewhere deeper than opinion, deeper than statistics. It came from the specific place where one professional acknowledges that another one was operating on a plane he could not reach. That is the foundation of this number 1 pick, not the record books, not the championships. The reaction of a man who raced against him and knew exactly what he was looking at. Case number 1. The greatest NASCAR driver Kenny Wallace ever saw? Richard Petty. 200 wins, 200. 7 Daytona 500 victories, 7 championships, numbers so disconnected from anything that came before or after them that they almost stop functioning as statistics and start functioning as something closer to mythology. But here's what gets lost inside the mythology. Richard Petty was a brilliant, technically masterful racing driver. The short-track craft he developed in the early part of his career, the super speedway intelligence he built across hundreds of events, the ability to manage a race, to conserve equipment, to read traffic, to make the right aggressive move at the right moment, and the right conservative move at every other moment. That was not luck. That was not era. That was a man who understood racing at a level that most of his competitors, by their own words, could not fully reach. You can say the era was different. You can say the competition level was different. You can say whatever you need to say to protect the narrative you walked in here with. But you cannot explain 200 wins as a product of circumstance. You cannot explain 7 championships as a product of luck. And you cannot explain the reaction that Wendell Wallace had when he talked about Richard Petty as anything other than one professional acknowledging the presence of something genuinely unreachable. There are good racers. There are great racers. There are champions. And then there is the king. So here are the 5. Number 5, Rusty Wallace. The most natural, God-given car talent the sport has ever produced. A man who wore a race car rather than drove one. Number 4, Jeff Gordon. The most cerebral, calculated, chess-playing competitor NASCAR has ever seen. 4 championships and 93 wins built on a mental precision that almost nobody in the sport could match. Number 3, Dale Earnhardt. A force of nature, a man who didn't just race the track, he raced the soul of every driver on it. 7 championships, 76 wins, and an irreplaceable piece of this sport's identity. Number 2, Jimmie Johnson. The most underrated dynasty in the history of American motorsport. 7 championships in the most competitive, most scrutinized, most resource-equal era the sport has ever known. The resume speaks, and it does not whisper. And number 1, Richard Petty, the king. Not because of the numbers alone, though the numbers are absurd, but because of what he meant. To this sport, to the people inside it, to a boy from St. Louis who grew up watching his father, a man who competed against greatness and knew exactly what it looked like. Reserve a particular kind of silence for one name and one name only. What does it mean to be great in NASCAR? People have argued about that question for as long as there have been race cars and opinions. After 40 years inside that world, here is what it comes down to. Greatness in this sport is when other racers, your rivals, the men spending every waking hour trying to beat you, stop thinking about beating you and start watching you. When the competitive instinct gets overridden just for a moment by the recognition that something extraordinary is happening right in front of them. Every man on this list produced that moment. In other drivers, in crew chiefs, in the people who knew the sport well enough to know exactly what they were seeing when they saw it. That is the only definition of greatness that holds up. The witness has said what he came to say. The court can decide what to do with it. Now, you've got opinions. That's what this sport is built on. So make your case. Who belongs on this list that didn't make it? Who shouldn't be here? Is the number 1 pick right? Or is there an argument that changes everything? Drop it in the comments. The debate isn't over. It's just getting started.